Debt ceiling negotiations between congressional leaders and the White House stalled yesterday after President Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy failed to come to terms on a compromise. Now, both leaders maintain that default is not in the cards. However, Democrats accuse GOP leadership of hostage-taking by not committing to completely taking default off the table.
The most immediate thing we can do is ensure the continued reliance of our economy and the financial system. The most important thing we have to do in that regard is to make sure the threat by the Speaker of the House to default on the national debt is off the table. For over 200 years, America has never, ever, ever failed to pay its debt. To put in the capital in colloquial terms, America is not a deadbeat nation. We have never, ever failed to meet the debt. And as a result, we're one of the most respected nations of the world. We pay our bills, and we should do so without reckless hostage-taking from some of the mega Republicans in Congress.
With no deal in sight, the president also said he's considering invoking the 14th Amendment to get around this.
I have been considering the 14th Amendment. And a man I have enormous respect for, Larry Tribe, who advised me for a long time, thinks that it would be legitimate. But the problem is it would have to be litigated. And in the meantime, without an extension, it would still end up in the same place. I'll be very blunt with you. When we get by this, I'm thinking about taking a look at months down the road as to see whether what the court would say about whether or not it does work.
So Lawrence Tribe wrote a New York Times op-ed very recently saying that he thinks that's a viable solution. When he was working for Biden during the Obama presidency, he did not think that, and Obama concluded that that would not be something he had the authority to do. I'm seeing, obviously, legal experts are mixed under whether this is a good pathway. Janet Yellen seems to think it's not.
What do you mean that he didn't think it was viable under Biden? My understanding is that they were workshopping this during the Obama administration. They opted not to use the strategy, but not that for political reasons, but not that was deemed to be a wrong strategy.
Okay,
this is politically risky strategy.
Well, and as Biden concedes there, it would actually have to be litigated, right? He would essentially be he'd have to go to the Supreme Court to say that, because the debt ceiling is a congressional act, and saying that detracts from his power as the executive. So ultimately it would land for the Supreme Court.
So to be clear, the 14th Amendment strategy is relying on this verbiage in the Constitution, which says the validity of the public debt authorized by law shall not be questioned. And the theory is that the Treasury Department can keep on borrowing because it has been given this kind of absolute authority, this absolute constitutional authority to not default on America's debt. And some people have said, well, he should go ahead and invoke this because litigation will stretch out. We can get us past the debt ceiling kind of cliff. I think it's just set to happen in June. Some other people said that even invoking this strategy would cause instability in the global markets in a way that would perhaps hurt Biden in an electoral context, that any instability is ultimately going to reflect negatively on him because he is the president and because he's in the middle of this presidential race, and that the context might be different in other times. People are pointing out, as Biden did, that of course America has never defaulted on its debt. The debt ceiling is a kind of a fiction, that Reagan raised the debt ceiling umpteenth times, that it's been raised, I believe, 78 times since the 1960s, and that to the extent that this is a hostage situation, that the messaging should be that Republicans are ultimately threatening a global economic crisis in order to get various cuts made to the budget that they're not able to get through other kind of legislative moments without this kind of leverage.
Right, and as our guest yesterday, Mike Lillis, pointed out, this scenario only presents itself when you have divided government, because the debt ceiling is gleefully raised by Republicans who have no actual interest in controlling spending when they actually have the power to do so.
Yeah.
Democrats have no interest in controlling spending, period. And so spending is not controlled.
Well, yes and no. So it's interesting because some Democrats have been putting forward proposals about what to cut. And what's so frustrating to me about these debt ceiling conversations is so little of it is about substantively what actually needs to be cut, because Republicans are trying not to be too specific about the fact that they want to do things like cut very popular so-called entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicaid and Medicare, raising the ages of eligibility on those programs, at the same time that they are refusing to do things like cut the military budget, despite posturing as kind of these anti-war populists. We interviewed Marjorie Taylor Greene recently on this show, and I asked her specifically, it was the day after, I believe, that the House passed their initial pass at this at the budget package that they wanted to put through. And I asked her why it was that all of the cuts seemed to be coming at the expense of poor and working people, and things like the military budget were not under the microscope, or a wealth tax wasn't an option. She said she does not support a wealth tax, and she said that she actually supports Biden's military budget and does not support any cuts to that budget, despite being a critic
that
of
was
the war in
very
Ukraine.
telling part of the interview, because she has articulated a different foreign policy vision that would allow us to have a more constrained, if you want to constrain our foreign policy, if you want to constrain our nation building, our involvement in every conflict on the globe, constrain the military budget.
Right.
Fire people
Right.
who work for the federal government in the national intelligence apparatus, in the,
Cut the FBI, and that's something she's advocated for. But as I also asked her in that interview, she has not proposed any legislation or done anything so far, at least, that would actually follow up on the rhetoric that she has been putting out there about defunding the FBI. Now,
I'm not picky. I'm not choosy. Here we can cut all those entitlements you like. We can cut. We can do all those things and the military budget. Like everything could be on the table.
We know. Fortunately or unfortunately, as Donald Trump would say, many people's grandmothers across the country feel very differently. By the way, here is California Representative Ro Khanna talking about the kinds of things he would propose to bring the budget in line from a more progressive perspective.
Sat down in a room with Speaker McCarthy. Maybe you have. You're both Californians, after all. What are your proposals?
I'm willing to sit down with him, and I have before. We worked on legislation. Here's one thing I think bipartisan we could get behind. You know, the people who got some of the COVID money who should not have qualified for it, multi-million-dollar firms that basically gamed the system. Why don't we audit everyone who took those COVID loans and make sure they actually qualified? That'd be a start. I'm not
sure
saying
you
that's
want to do that,
pay for the
Congressman,
deficit,
because
but
you may not like what you find. You can search who took COVID money on its public data, and I don't know if you want to do that.
Well, look, I mean, I'm all for the mom and pop shops getting it, but if you're a multi-million-dollar business and you got COVID funding and you didn't qualify, I mean, that should be money coming back to the taxpayers. There's a lot more that I want in terms of repealing some of the top tax cuts for the very wealthy that Trump had and Bush had, but those are going to be more contentious. But the COVID money that went out to people who didn't deserve it, that should be bipartisan.
So that's very interesting. I agree. I'm always happy to crack down on waste, fraud, and abuse in government funding and welfare programs. Absolutely abhorrent to me the idea of so many firms that were able to collect COVID payments that are wealthy, et cetera. We covered how a lot of media institutions were able to collect the payments. That said, we've talked about IRS issues in the past and how they just tend to go after poorer, less resourced people. So in practice, how do you, I think you'd run into the same problem. How would you empower the auditors to go after the people?
Look, that is not quite the black box that I think some commentators on both the left and the right have made it out to be. There are problems with empowering a agency that can do what the IRS can do, point blank, period. But we know that 10 years ago, when it was at the funding levels that Biden has restored it to, it used those resources to go after more wealthy people as a proportion of the people that it went after than it goes after now. So we know that more funding in real life terms results in more rich people actually being held accountable.
We're trying to save money here, not spend more money.
No, we recoup the money in taxes because the rich people is where all of the money is. Going after somebody who barely makes enough to be taxed in the first place isn't exactly filling the coffers of the IRS. And it's also worth noting, talking about the Trump tax cuts, he says politically that's difficult to wind back. It's something that we should be talking about. As of 2020, they had added almost $4 trillion to the deficit. The idea that these conservatives, are able to posture as though they're the deficit hawks and that they are the ones that want to make sure this isn't a deadbeat nation and all of that rhetoric, those kind of policies, these giveaways to the rich. Something like 83 cents out of every dollar of those tax cuts went to the top 1%, and they added to our federal deficit. And so to not want to repeal that at the same time that you're not seriously entertaining options like what Bernie and Ro Khanna have been talking about in terms of raising the Social Security tax. That's a regressive tax where working people, working class, middle class people are paying a much higher percentage of their income into Social Security than the rich, because it's capped at what, $160,000 a year. And your salary over that doesn't contribute to Social Security. Is that the kind of system we want to have? And why are we talking about raising the retirement age for everyday people instead of looking at simply reforming some of these tax systems to make the rich pay their fair share?
Okay, we got to go. More Rising right after this.